spot. Oh shit, the cops! Be cool, fool. They ain't gonna roll up. All they want is fucking donuts. So why the fuck he keep looking? I guess to get his life cooking. I just came home, ain't trying to see central booking. Oh shit, now he looking in my face. You better haul ass, cause I ain't with no fucking chase. So lace up your boots, cause I'm about to shoot a true motherfucker going out for the loot. Take that, motherfuckers. Damn, what's that shit, boy? Hit this cheek.
Guy in there killed your father.
What the fuck are you talking about?
Barry Haydu. Detective Lieutenant in the Clifton Police Force. Retired today. That's his retirement party.
Everybody always told me he was a fucking cop. I thought he was dead. My mother can't even talk about it.
Did the hit for Jilly Ruffalo. Jilly and your old man were in the can together. Jilly stabbed your old man's cellmate to death. So when your old man got paroled, he tracked down Jilly. Took out his eyes so bad he couldn't even put a glass one in. Loyal, your old man.
That's what I heard. Some guy's eye. They hit my dad right outside my house, right? He was bringing home a crib for me?
Yeah. Well, no, he was outside the house, but he wasn't carrying a crib. He had a bunch of TV trays. Could have been a crib just as easily. Did it on contract. Made a lot of money over the years.
So how come he's still fucking walking?
Because he's been useful. But he's outlived it. As of his cute little ceremony this afternoon.
Is that him? With the sombrero on?
No, you can't tell from here. Well, maybe. Maybe it, yeah. Yeah, probably. Hey. Nice house, apparently. Say he paid cash for it. Good luck.
Hey, Joe. Okay. You know I'm a police officer.
Uh-huh. Engraving on this watch says you retired today. You remember Dickie Moltisanti?
No.
No? Is that what you said?
Is he a friend of yours?
He was my father.
Look, I don't know who told you I had anything to do with the death of your father, but their information is faulty. Or they are deliberately not telling you the truth.
Are you inferring that you didn't take cash from Jilly Ruffalo to whack my father while he was carrying a TV tray for me to watch TV?
I don't know anybody named Ruffalo. You're being set up. He's lying to you, whoever he is.
Wouldn't make any difference.
What do you mean it wouldn't make any difference?
He wants you dead.
All right, look. I got a boat. It's a Sea Ray 230. It's almost brand new. I didn't kill your father, but you could... You don't want a cop kill on your head!
And what if they won't pull over, TC? I'm not gonna take on a limo in this car.
No problem.
I'm sorry.
Pull him outside.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. What are you gonna do?
Pull over! Police!
Police? In a Ferrari? Freeze! Don't move a muscle or I'll put a bullet through it. Special Investigator Finneday. You're under arrest.
What's the charge, officer?
Speeding, reckless driving, endangering another vehicle, and impersonating an officer.
How do you think it's going?
Oh, couldn't be better. You two are terrific.
As soon as they come through the door, we're gonna nail them.
Oh, shit.
I missed my game. Again.
Fucking loser.
Now Reese will have to lead the guys to victory.
Who's Reese?
Kenneth Reese. He was my backup quarterback at the academy, and he's been waiting for a chance like this since 1963, and now he's got it because of you.
A true story of murder, madness, and the mafia. Written by Gene Mustaine and Jerry Capisi. Performed by Victor Bevine.
Prologue. It was about 6 p.m., already pitch black out, and one of those wet, stingy snows was coming down hard. Mr. Todaro parked his car in the street in front of the crew's clubhouse. He was an older gentleman, 60, I think. What was about to happen to him was, well, to me it was something out of Auschwitz. Roy had ordered Freddie, who was like Roy's servant, to lure Mr. Todaro to the clubhouse by making him think Roy had a used car to sell. But actually, Roy was going to kill him so that the man's nephew, a friend of Roy's, could take over Mr. Todaro's film production business. Roy was always available for this kind of work. After the first few, I think he started enjoying it. Anyway, it's dark and it's snowing, and as expected, Mr. Todaro sees Roy's guy Freddie waiting outside and says hello. They start walking toward the clubhouse. Now, there is a picture window with Venetian blinds next to the doorway, and as Freddie's walking, he sees someone inside the clubhouse pinch the blinds and look out. All he sees is the person's eyeballs. It's eerie, and he begins to quiver. He knows Mr. Todaro is going to die, but he's never seen Roy DeMeo murder before. Mr. Todaro goes in first. There is a living room off the hallway that leads to the kitchen. As soon as Mr. Todaro is past the opening to the living room, Freddie is startled to see someone he knows, Chris, leaping out into the hallway with a butcher knife in his hand. It was almost a balletic move. Chris, by the way, was the first kid to join Roy's crew. At the moment, he doesn't have any clothes on except for his jockey shorts. He always worked in his underwear because he didn't want to bloody his clothes. Freddie starts to wet his pants. He believes Chris is going to stab him, but no, Chris just grabs him by the arm and wings him out of the way. "You, over here," he says. Freddie then sees Roy DeMeo coming out of the dark from the other end of the hall, just gliding along, and he's got a gun in one hand and a white towel in the other. He just glides up and shoots dumbfounded Mr. Todaro in the head, and before the man even hits the floor, Roy is wrapping the towel around his head to prevent the blood from spurting all over. Then Chris comes over and stabs Mr. Todaro in the heart, many times. That stops it from pumping blood, Roy tells Freddie, who's still shaking. The murder only takes a few seconds, but of course they're not done yet. They're going to make Mr. Todaro disappear. Some other kids in Roy's crew appear from somewhere, and they all drag Mr. Todaro's body across the kitchen and into the bathroom, where they put it in a bathtub. Now, before they begin cutting Mr. Todaro up, they have to wait 45 minutes or so until his blood congeals. Dismemberment isn't so messy that way, Roy tells Freddie, like Freddie was a medical student. So they wait. Maybe they even ordered a pizza, I don't know, but we do know they did that once while waiting. One of the men waiting actually lived in the clubhouse. The others called him Dracula, and not just because he had silver hair and a deep voice. As I indicated, Mr. Todaro was one of those freelance jobs that Roy and the crew did. There were a lot of those, but normally they were out making money for a gangster named Nino. You knew Nino was a gangster as soon as he walked into a room. He was a murderer too, but did not do as much killing, and so far as we know, was not present for any of the dismemberments at the clubhouse. Neither was Dominic, who was the guy Nino used to collect his cash and keep an eye on the DeMeo crew. When Dominic was a little boy, Nino practically stole him from his father. Dominic went on to be a Green Beret war hero in Nam and was a tough guy, but he did not have a killer's eyes. Roy and his crew, they all did. Eventually, Mr. Todaro's body was taken out of the bathtub and placed on either a tarpaulin or one of those swimming pool liners they sometimes used. Then Roy and his crew sawed the man apart, put him in garbage bags, and took him to the biggest dump in Brooklyn. It was like a disassembly line. None of Mr. Todaro was ever seen again. This butchery went on all the time. It was systematic. The system was, almost ceremonious. And they used to talk about the kick they got from it, the high, the power. They used to say killing made them feel like God. Of all the horrifying stories about Roy DeMeo and his crew, the murder of Mr. Todaro is the one that stays in the mind of FBI Special Agent Arthur Ruffles. While telling it in the main conference room of FBI headquarters in New York City, Ruffles, a former high school teacher, rose to his feet to mimic the killer's movements. His audience, other agents, their boss, and the authors of this book, was spellbound. The room felt colder than before. Ruffles had transported us to a charnel house. They were the scariest people we've ever seen, he continued, sitting down. Just in Roy's crew, there were 5 people you'd have to call serial killers. This was in the fall of 1989. It was our first major interview for a story we came upon while researching a previous book on John Gotti, the ex-hijacker who bludgeoned his way to the top of the underworld and became a household name because of his winning streak in courtrooms. Poking into Gotti's past, we found a transcript of a conversation secretly recorded by FBI agents in which Gotti's brother Gene said he and Violent John were afraid to take on Roy DeMeo because Roy had an army of killers. At the time the comment was made, only a few cops and residents of certain neighborhoods even knew the crew existed. But who were these people so notorious in their malignant realm that even the Gotti brothers were afraid? And what had they done? Out of the search for those answers comes this story about the most foul and prolific gang of murderers in the modern history of the United States. The Roy DeMeo crew was the coming together of an uncommon union of killing spirits. Roy and his followers killed for profit, for revenge, and finally, for fun. Many of their victims were themselves criminals, but many others were innocents who simply strayed into their merciless path or who committed particular acts, such as insulting someone in a bar, that agitated the hairiest triggers anyone would want to encounter. Jules Bonavolanta, supervisor of the FBI's organized crime squads in New York, opened that first interview this way. We speculate this group killed in excess of 200 people. A great many were just innocent people who got in the way, who just wandered in, who just happened to witness something. In other words, wanton killing, with no remorse. Officials of the FBI, the New York City Police Department, and other agencies that eventually joined forces and tried to put the DeMeo crew out of business faced monumental obstacles because witnesses to some of the murders never came forward and because so many victims, such as Mr. Todaro, were never found. The gang was unique not just for its violence, but also for its pedigree. Some of the most important members were still teenagers when they joined. One was a champion race car driver. One had taken and passed the cop's entrance exam. Another's brother was a cop. One more was the product of an upright Jewish family. His brother was a doctor. The gang's leader was smart enough to be a doctor, and his favorite uncle was a prominent New York lawyer. This story will tell who the gang members were, how they got together, how they killed, and how they were brought to justice, one way or the other. It also is the story of many of their victims, including a teenage beauty queen, a college student, and a father and son, short of money and long on naivete. The saga unfolds across a raw and treacherous landscape that stretches from Kuwait to Beverly Hills and from New York to Miami, and against the background of a ponderous criminal justice system that frequently misfired, and not just because of the usual bureaucratic nonsense. Some heroic cops and prosecutors battled the DeMeo crew, but some cops not so heroic aided and abetted it. 2 men that Special Agent Arthur Ruffles mentioned while describing the demise of Mr. Todaro, Nino and Dominic, are central to the story. Nino's full name was Anthony Frank Gaggi. He was what Roy DeMeo wanted to be, a top mafia gangster. His roots extend to Lucky Luciano and the dawn of organized crime in America. Strictly speaking, Dominic was Nino's nephew, but son was closer to the truth, for better and for worse. It is because of Dominic that we are all able to tell many parts of the story. We met him in an elevator at a federal courthouse. In our earlier book on John Gotti, he was mentioned in one paragraph in which we described him as a thief, loan shark, and drug addict. The characterization came from a legal document. "So you're the guys who called me a thief, a loan shark, and a junkie?" he said. We were happy there were cops in the elevator with us and that he began to smile. "There's more to the story," he added. It was the first few seconds of eventually hundreds of hours of conversations with Dominic Montilio. They were conducted in separate cities around the country and at prearranged times on the telephone. He never refused to answer a question. As with the other sources for this book, he was not paid any money. "All I want is for someone to lay it out the way it was," he said at the outset. "Then maybe my kids can understand what happened to me." All the characters in this book are, or were, living people. Almost all their conversations come from hundreds of interviews with one or more of the participants, or from some 500,000 pages of official documents, public and secret. A few are based on what people recall being told. As memory is never really completely infallible, no nonfiction book can be. But we have endeavored to make this one as true as experience and judgment enable. The land is full of bloody crimes, and the city is full of violence. The prophet Ezekiel. Only the dead know Brooklyn. Thomas Wolfe. Part 1. Love and War. Chapter 1. Uncle Nino. Dominic grew up in a house dominated by his Uncle Nino. It was a roomy house, but not fancy, just a rectangle of bricks the color of dried blood, sandwiched between others like it on an ordinary street in Brooklyn, New York, the borough of churches and homes. The Gaggi clan, mostly one generation removed from Sicily, occupied 3 floors but shared a common kitchen and a common wariness for the world beyond what they called the bunker. From 1947, when he was born, and on through the Eisenhower years, Dominic lived there with his mother, another uncle, his grandparents, assorted aunts and cousins. But Uncle Nino, who had an opinion about everything, was always the boss of the bunker. Early on, Dominic's father had lived there too, but he was a drunk and a bum and had run away when his son was about age 3, or so Uncle Nino always said. To outsiders and little boys, Nino Gaggi was a successful car salesman. With no children of his own until his nephew was 9, he was affectionate and attentive, if always aggressively and profanely blunt-spoken. "Your dad was a drinker. He treated your mother, my sister, like shit," he would tell the boy. Growing up, Dominic sought particulars, but Uncle Nino always blocked inquiry with further condemnation. His mother Marie was gentle, but not much more forthcoming. She would say her husband was a good man, but they had a hard time living together, and the marriage just never worked out. "Next question, please." Once in a great while, though, she gave up a biographical detail. So her son came to know his father, Anthony Santamaria, a popular boy from the neighborhood, who served in the Army Air Corps and then fell in love with his mother after coming home a hero from the war. When Dominic began showing some athletic ability, his mother also gave him a tiny silver boxing glove his father had given her. It was inscribed, Army Air Corps Boxing Champ, 1943. The boxing glove became a cherished memento because, in time, Dominic recalled his father only as someone recalls a few scenes from an obscure play seen years before, and therefore has trouble deciding what the storyline was. His earliest memory was of the boxer coming home one night, tweaking him on a cheek, then stumbling into the bathroom and puking like a baby. Bombed out of his mind, Dominic concluded, as he and the memory got older. The second memory was more a sequence of scenes, probably from his 4th year, 1951, sometime after his father left the bunker, when they were allowed to see one another on Sundays. His father was living a few blocks away, back home with his parents, but after Dominic was dropped off, the reunions usually led to the Magic Lantern, a rowdy local tavern where the Army Air Corps champ defeated all comers bare-fisted for money and drinks. Dominic never forgot his father telling him during one of these jousts that he would prefer living with him, but it was impossible so long as it meant living with Uncle Nino, too. "He wants me to do things I'm against," he said. "Like what?" "Some things you can't understand yet." Anthony's brother-in-law and estranged wife threw fits when they heard about the Magic Lantern. Consequently, Dominic never spoke to his real father again. The boxer stayed in the neighborhood a while and occasionally his son saw him walking along. But as his Uncle Nino and Mother Marie had instructed, he crossed the street and avoided him like the man had chicken pox. The boy felt terrible, but his mother said life is terrible sometimes. The man is a fucking bum, Uncle Nino added, bouncing the little Gambino on his knee. I'll take care of you now. Obviously, Dominic was too powerless to protest and too ignorant of family history to wonder if this was the right course for his life.
Antonino Gaggi came to life on a hot-tempered summer's evening in 1925.
He was the third and last child of Angelo and Mary Gaggi, who lived in a cold-water walk-up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a brawling area of immigrant angst. In time, his first name became Anthony, but its original form yielded his nickname, Nino. Some avenues on the Lower East Side were known by letters, so it also had a nickname, Alphabet City. The Gaggis lived on 12th Street near Avenue A, and the neighborhood's noisy hub, Tompkins Square Park. Angelo Gaggi, a placid man from Palermo, ran a barber shop. His iron-willed wife was a sweatshop seamstress who quit work to stay at home with Nino and her other children. 2-year-old Marie and 1-year-old Rosario, later known as Roy. It was a hard life in a hard neighborhood. The couple wanted out as soon as possible, but the Depression hit and things got worse. Men stopped getting haircuts as often, and Angelo laid off barbers he employed. As soon as little Nino was able, he was put to work sweeping up and polishing the shoes of men lucky enough to have jobs. With the suspicious clans huddled together, with their common anxiety but different languages and strange rituals, the dense streets were always filled with disagreement. Children on virtually each block formed gangs known as mobs. Kids without the stomach for fighting were lucky to arrive at school with their milk money. In 1932, 7-year-old Nino posed for his first Holy Communion photograph at the Roman Catholic Church across the street. The photograph showed no trace of cowardice in his face, nor evidence of a lost fight. The camera did capture a remarkably handsome, utterly rigid child, appearing to possess great discipline. It was proof he had inherited his mother's willful personality. On the other hand, Nino's brother Roy resembled, both in appearance and demeanor, their father, a slender man with a prominent Adam's apple and a weak chin. Nino's sister Marie was somewhere between, solid and plain like her mother, but like her father, reserved and inclined to resign herself to situations. Mary Gaggi was so struck by Nino's photo. He was such a manly boy, she spent a few scarce dollars and made it a postcard she mailed to relatives. Because his mother doted on him and Nino took advantage, Nino's sister thought he was a mama's boy. The accusation always caused a prominent vein left of his jugular to swell. Its thickness was how people measured little Nino's anger. As his sister and brother had, Nino attended public school the first 3 grades, then transferred to the parish school behind the church across from his home. Besides after-school chores at his father's shop, he delivered flowers. By age 10, he roamed the Lower East Side confidently and was hanging out at Tompkins Square, the neighborhood piazza at Avenue A and 10th Street. This was the domain of Alphabet City's toughest gang, the 10th Street Mob. Its boss was a wild 13-year-old, Rocco Barbella, a ferocious fighter who took on much older boys before large crowds in the park. Later on, as Rocky Graziano, he became middleweight boxing champion of the world. Many fighters came out of the neighborhood, but only 10th Street spawned 2 middleweight champions. The second was Jake LaMotta, with whom Nino became friendly before Jake, like Rocco, was sent to reform school. The professional handle Jake adopted, Raging Bull, captured all the fury of Alphabet City. The mobs aligned along turf and ethnic lines, which was why a boy from 12th Street and Avenue A ran with the boys from 10th Street. With fists and sticks, the 10th Street mob fought the Avenue B mob, the 11th Street mob, and anyone who had a smart remark. They swiped fruit from pushcarts and clipped candy from newsstands, and when the mostly Irish cops of the day grabbed them, penalties were administered on the street. Nino never complained that he was given an official beating, but he developed a seething grudge against cops. Given the anti-cop grousing that went on in his father's shop, a beating was not required. All the official plundering of Sicily through the ages made contempt for authority a Sicilian tradition. Passing cops on the street, Nino sneered and swore under his breath. It was obvious that the cops operated according to a double standard. The men who ran the neighborhood's gambling, loan sharking, and fencing rackets operated in plain sight. It was obvious the Rackies were prosperous. Lucky Luciano, the biggest gangster in New York City, was out of an Avenue A walk-up. So it was natural that Nino emulated that life and stood on street corners flipping coins, mimicking George Raft as menacing Guido Rinaldo in a big film of the day, Scarface, the story of Al Capone, a New York-born Rackie. Nino's mother, Mary, knew the phenomenon. She grew up in the similarly disgruntled Hell's Kitchen neighborhood on Manhattan's West Side. One of her playmates was George Raft, and she always joked to Nino that her old friend became a movie star just by being himself and every other Guido Rinaldo on the corner. Nino's father, Angelo, was even more acquainted. A cousin of his, Frank Scalise, was a powerful gangster and an associate of the nation's most infamous men. Luciano, Capone, Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz. Scalise sat at the table when those men met and divvied up the rackets among families of criminals that collectively became known as the Mafia. Milquetoast Angelo did not move in such circles, but he and Scalise played together in Palermo as kids, emigrated about the same time, and still socialized at each other's homes out of a yearning for old country camaraderie. When Scalise came to 12th Street, neighbors buzzed over his car, clothes, and jewelry. How he made his living was not a polite topic, but an Alphabet City child did not need to be told when someone was connected. The sight of Scalise entering the Gaji walk-up boosted Nino's standing with the corner boys. With audacious solemnity, he told them, "I only want two things when I grow up. I want to be just like Frank Scalise, and when I die, I want to die on the street with a gun in my hand." The boys were well aware that death on the street was an occasional fact of that life. Now and then, people came running up to the church across the street from Nino's house to inform the pastor that some Rackie had been shot and was lying mortally wounded and in need of extreme unction, the church's last rites. When Nino was almost 14, he graduated 8th grade. Though contemptuous of the work, he began barbering hair in his father's shop. Between that and his florist's delivery job, he had spending money for the first time. Leaving childhood behind, he became acutely interested in the image he projected. He began dressing as sharp as funds allowed, and when his eyesight deteriorated, he chose spectacles so dark they appeared to be sunglasses. He also learned to play dice, but decided gambling was not for him. He could not bear losing and hated handing over money to anyone. He was intrigued, however, by the loan sharks who circled the dice games, charging the foolish gamblers up to 5% interest, or VIG for vigorish, a week. He saw that taking advantage of a sucker's weakness was what the rackets were about. Unlike his siblings, he did not even try high school. Low regard for education was another immigrant Sicilian tradition, especially if work was waiting at home. And Nino's parents provided that when they announced to his dismay that the family was moving to rural New Jersey, where they had bought a small farm. Nino stewed on the farm. In 1942, after war broke out in Europe and Asia, and after his 17th birthday, he tried to escape by enlisting in the army. He was 5'8", 160 pounds, and muscular from hard labor, but he was rejected during the physical exam because he was too nearsighted. This hardened the chip on his shoulder about men in uniform. In New Jersey, the adults did not adjust well to a farming life either. As Angelo Gaji later said, they were city people who barely knew a hoe from a rake. After 2 years, they gave it up, but decided against returning to the Lower East Side. Some of their relatives had since moved across the East River to Brooklyn, the promised land of immigrant families. In 1943, Angelo and Mary found a house they liked in Bath Beach, an Italian neighborhood on the southwest coast of Brooklyn. It was a roomy but bunker-like brick house and affordable. $100 down secured a mortgage for $8,550. The deed was placed in the name of the eldest child, Marie, the one who understood English best. Compared to Alphabet City, Bath Beach was a paradise. 100 years earlier, it was a fashionable resort area for the wealthy, and even by 1943, there were still only a few windswept marshes between the Gaji bunker on Cropsey Avenue and the Atlantic Ocean. Coney Island and all its amusement parks lay only a couple of miles away. Bath Beach adjoined Bensonhurst, a larger, similar community of immigrants beginning to make it. In both, merchants and residents replicated the culture of their old Sicilian and southern Italian villages. Tiny cafes and fruit and vegetable stands lined commercial streets. In residential areas, fig trees grew in backyards, and grapevines formed canopies over makeshift carports. 18 now, Nino scouted opportunity. Not to his parents' surprise or particular alarm, he turned to his father's connected cousin, Frank Scalisi, whose influence had continued to grow. He was a leader of the city's largest mafia gang and had made a fortune as a loan shark. His customers included many top politicians and union officials. So Nino got a job on a truck dock. In hardly any time, he was a supervisor. He hated it as much as the farm, but worked hard and added 10 more pounds of muscle. He bossed older workers with confidence and never tolerated sloth or tardiness. Angelo Gaggi opened up another barbershop, and his wife and daughter got work in a dress factory. His other son, Roy, who had enlisted in the army but was sent home after a training camp injury, sold peanut dispensers to local bars. Roy had grown up in the shadow of his younger brother and would stay there. Over the next 2 years, Nino cultivated his connection to Scalisi. At age 20, he quit his job on the truck dock, but not on paper. He was made a ghost employee as a favor to Scalisi. The phony job covered him with the tax man, and he began a full-time life on the sly. To his parents, he was still just devoted son Anthony, a respectful young man, as handsome as George Raft, strong and self-assured, and destined to find what best suited him. Mary Gaggi especially felt that way. Like her brother, Marie Gaggi had matured into an attractive person, brunette and shapely. When the neighborhood men came home from war in 1945, she fell in love with Anthony Santamaria, a local legend whose boxing skills were regularly on display in barroom exhibitions. Nino was scornfully unimpressed. His childhood friends Jake LaMotta and Rocky Graziano were now marquee professional fighters, not barroom hacks. He derided Anthony Santamaria as having no future. The boxer was just a delivery man for a butcher shop. The man also drank too much, in Nino's exaggerated estimation. Nino did not drink liquor at all. He did not like losing control. He did not smoke either. He prided himself on having no personal vices. Marie resented her brother's heavy-handed opinions. Anthony Santamaria was always a gentleman around her. Late in 1945, they married, and he moved into the Gaggi bunker. 19 months later, their only child was born. Marie incorporated her gentle father's name into the infants, Dominic Angelo Santamaria. Anthony Gaggi was the only adult in the bunker who did not rise early in the morning to go to work, so he became Dominic's primary babysitter. Nino made his money at night, loan sharking in the bars and pool halls of Brooklyn, and doing whatever else came along. At home, his business was not discussed. He had a new car, cash, clothes, and no job. That said everything. His parents accepted life as it came. This way, everything was normal. Everyone in the bunker was the same way, including Anthony Santamaria, who just tried to keep his distance. In 1950, however, the relationship between brother-in-laws, strained from the start, grew frayed. It happened after Nino developed what would be a lifelong interest in the money to be made in the automobile business, one way or another, and asked Anthony to help stage a phony car accident so that Nino could defraud an insurance company. Anthony refused, and Nino began complaining that Anthony was a freeloader who abused Marie. With most men, Anthony would have answered these accusations with fists, but he feared Nino might strike back with bullets. At the bunker, he kept going his own way, but since everyone ate in the common kitchen, it was hard. A Cold War Anthony had no chance of winning set in. In time, with no money to take his wife and child away, he became sullen and defeated. He got deep into the bottle, began staying out late, arguing with his wife, and by 1951, his marriage was on the rocks and he was history. For all intents and purposes, 26-year-old Nino became the father of the 4-year-old Santamaria boy, Dominic. No one ever sat Dominic down and explained why and how Nino was different from other men. He was left to learn by osmosis, to read between the lines and keep his mouth shut. What indirect lessons there were came in the form of pointed remarks, such as when Dominic, shortly after entering the first grade, said to Nino that he wanted to be a policeman someday. On his way to Public School 200 each morning, he had enjoyed friendly encounters with cops changing shifts at the precinct station house across from the school. "I hate cops," Nino huffed. "No one in our family has ever been a cop." When Dominic, after hearing about the Korean War at school, next said he wanted to be a soldier, Nino said people were fools to die for anyone but their families. Because Uncle Nino was so sure about everything, his nephew was in awe of him. Dominic was age 7 the first time the police came to his house. In his room one night, he woke to a frightful racket. He knew but a few words of Sicilian, but they included police, which his grandfather was screaming repeatedly. He then heard a door slam, someone thrown against a wall, and Nino swearing loudly. His mother came and sat with him until he stopped bawling. Some men had just come to see Uncle Nino, she said. In truth, Anthony Gaggi had been arrested and taken away in handcuffs, not by police, but by the FBI. He was accused of running an international stolen car ring out of the used car lot he had opened in a nearby neighborhood, no doubt with the backing of Frank Scalise, who had become the number 2 man or underboss of the city's largest mafia family. Scalise lived in the Bronx, north of Manhattan, but supervised the family's various branches, the largest of which was in Brooklyn. Nino was not a made member of the family yet, and by tradition would not be until he demonstrated he was a capable money earner and a killer. The car operation showed the former. Over 2 years, Nino and 2 others created phony registrations for dozens of non-existent Cadillacs, then dispatched thieves to steal ones that matched. The hot caddies' vehicle identification numbers were replaced, new license plates obtained, with the bogus registrations were installed, and within hours they were on their way to some cash customer in Florida, Georgia, Texas, or Mexico. Nino was released on bail in a few hours. The next morning, no one in the bunker mentioned the FBI raid of the night before. Everything was normal, though Dominic went off to school with a first inkling of what Anthony Santamaria might have meant when he said Nino wanted him to do things he was against. Meeting expectations, he kept the revelation to himself. The stolen car case dragged on nearly 3 years, with all the classic earmarks of mafia tampering. Witnesses suffered sudden memory loss. Co-defendants who pleaded guilty either refused to testify against Nino or changed their stories from grand jury to trial. By early 1956, the federal prosecutor was left with a shell of a case, and a jury found Nino not guilty. Nino did not take the stand, adhering to the first vow a potential made man must make: absolute non-cooperation with official authority. While the case pended, Nino also took another vow: to love and honor Rose Mary Pizzella, a stunning blonde telephone operator whom he married shortly before his 29th birthday. She was 8 years younger, a ringer for Betty Grable, and had lived with her parents atop a furniture shop a few doors from his used car lot. She and Nino had to petition the judge in Nino's case to permit Nino to leave the state for a honeymoon, after which they took over the first floor of the bunker, forcing Dominic and his mother to smaller accommodations on the second floor. The couple's first child, a boy, was born a year later. Though a neighbor lady had become Dominic's chief babysitter, Nino still looked after him if the neighbor was unavailable and the other adults were still at their jobs. If he had business to conduct or people to see, he took his nephew along. At family events, the boy had bounced on Scalise's knee many times, listening to folk tales of Sicily and the suffering of its people. But now he began to meet others, with whom Nino would rise to power, men he was encouraged to regard as uncles. The first was Paul Castellano. Ironically, his father owned the butcher shop that once employed an upstairs tenant, Anthony Santamaria, as a delivery man. After his wife divorced him, however, Anthony had quit and was gone from the neighborhood by the time Dominic returned to the shop to visit Uncle Paulie. By appearances, Paul was following his father into the meat business. But he also was top aide to Carlo Gambino, who ran Scalise family business in Brooklyn. Carlo, a sly Sicilian who arrived in America in 1922 as a cargo ship stowaway, and Paul were cousins, and Paul had married one of Carlo's sisters. Carlo was 15 years older than Paul, who was a decade older than Nino. To Dominic, Nino always described Paul and Carlo simply as important men it was an honor to know.
Several times, Dominic joined them and others for afternoon espresso, and by the way the men seemed to defer to Uncle Carlo, a quietly spoken man with a notably large beak, he sensed that Carlo was almost as important as Frank Scalise.
Once, as one of these sit-downs ended and Dominic said goodbye to Carlo, Nino described him as a smart boy with the speed of a deer. The boy never forgot Carlo's reply. Smarter like a fox, so that's good. The fox recognizes the traps. But the deer? It's better to be a lion than a deer. The lion scares away the wolves. If you are a lion and a fox, nothing defeats you. As any boy would, Dominic accepted Carlo's observations as original thoughts, and for several years quoted them to friends. Not until much later did he learn that Carlo was cribbing from the philosophy of Niccolò Machiavelli, the Italian Renaissance statesman. Carlo had found a veneer for his life in Machiavelli's famous treatise, The Prince. Whatever a ruler has to do to gain or hold power, he must do. Through the mid-1950s, Nino's body began showing the effects of a basically sedentary life. About the only exercise he got was taking his pet boxer Prince for a walk. He was still handsome, but now round-faced and jowly. He still had the smooth skin and inky black hair of his youth, but his muscles sagged and he had ballooned to about 200 pounds, which did not lie well in a man 5 feet 8 inches tall. He still drank only wine, but with a multi-course dinner. With his broad shoulders, dark wavy hair, brown eyes, and high, strong cheekbones, young Dominic was emerging as a chip off the Anthony Santa Maria block, right down to the small gap between 2 upper front teeth. Even though active and athletic, he also was a bit chunky around the middle. In school, the boy made friends easily and caught on quickly. One day in 1957, his 10th year, he came home all excited and wearing a blue button with the word President stenciled across it. He rushed to tell Nino how he had been honored by his classmates. "Guess what happened?" he asked, so impatient he supplied his own answer. "I got elected class president." "What does a class president do?" "I take care of the class when the teacher leaves the room. If anyone's bad, I write their name down." Nino frowned. "That just means you're a rat." "A rat?" "A rat, a stool pigeon. You can't be a stool pigeon. No one in our family can be a stool pigeon. You go back and tell your teacher you can't be no class president." "But I was elected," Dominic said meekly. "It isn't for our family. Tell the teacher you can't do it." The next day, Dominic did as ordered. His teacher asked why many times, but he never gave a straight answer. His evasiveness was proof that the lessons he received at home were having their effect. Telling the truth would have made him a stool pigeon against Uncle Nino. In Bath Beach, as when they lived on the Lower East Side, the Gaji clan were members of the local Catholic parish, St. Finbarr's, but as before, only the women and the children went to Mass regularly. As Nino's mother had with him when he was a boy, Dominic's mother exposed him to the church's doctrine and ceremonial rituals, but as with Nino, not to much effect. For instance, he never made the connection between his surname, Santa Maria, and the Feast of Assumption, when Mary was said to have been assumed from earth straight to heaven. When at his confirmation ceremony on May 5, 1957, Dominic became a soldier of Christ, the day was more a revelation of familial relationships than a reflection of any religious significance. The ceremony began with him and other children lined up outside the church with the adults they had selected as their godfathers and godmothers, their protectors in life should anything happen to their parents. Home movies show that the man Dominic had chosen was wearing a nifty charcoal suit, a red silk tie, and a red carnation, and that he was fidgeting with his dark glasses as if nervous. Nino Gaji had not been in St. Finbarr's for some time, but when the drum and bugle corps signaled the ceremony's start, he put a godfatherly arm around Dominic Angelo Santa Maria and marched inside. Even though Dominic had begun to notice, after the family got its first television set, that Uncle Nino always cheered the villains, his mental picture of his godfather was still blurred. A few weeks after the confirmation ceremony, however, it was brought violently into focus by a sequence of events. One afternoon in June 1957, a distinguished-looking man, dapperly dressed in pale yellow slacks and a matching shirt, was buying peaches at his neighborhood deli in the Bronx when an assassin came from behind and shot him 4 times. The victim, Frank Scalisi, was 62 years old. The next day in his home, police found 100 photos of him vacationing in Italy with Lucky Luciano, the former hero of Avenue A, who 10 years before had been deported as an undesirable alien for helping bring the mafia from Sicily to New York. They also recovered his loan shark book, a ledger of illegal loans that included the names of some 20 prominent officials. In Bath Beach, Marie Gaji told her son that Scalisi had passed away, but at the wake in the Bronx, Dominic learned the harsher reality and overheard Scalisi's fiery brother Joseph vowing revenge. Not much later, the Gaji family traveled to the Bronx again, this time to comfort the family of Joseph Scalisi, who had disappeared. "He left last Friday and just never came home," Dominic heard one of the sobbing relatives say, as his highly agitated godfather huddled in a corner with many grave-looking men. Some weeks later, with still no trace of Joseph Scalisi, a gangster named Albert Anastasia was assassinated in a Manhattan hotel. The press reacted as though Mayor Robert F. Wagner himself had been killed. No one tried to shield Dominic from the radio or television coverage, and he concluded that the adults intentionally decided to let him learn the hard truths about Nino and the important men from strangers. The news reports identified Anastasia as the leader of New York's biggest criminal gang. His former right-hand man was Frank Scalisi, whose brother Joseph was also presumed murdered. All the murders were part of a war between two gangs. The new boss of the Anastasia gang might be Carlo Gambino, who was sly like a fox. This last report struck Dominic like a thunderbolt, and he added a silent kicker, and strong like a lion. After Anastasia was in the ground, Nino announced it would be best if the Gaggi family stayed inside the bunker a few days. Filled with new information, Dominic knew that a siege was on and took it as a test of his bravery and loyalty. Holed up, the family passed the time as normally as possible by playing cards and games. The only discordant note was sounded by Dominic's mother, whom he heard complaining to her parents about the stupidity of that life of her brothers. Although it was like sitting around waiting for a bomb to go off, Dominic managed to act as normal as anyone. The boy, who had lately taken an interest in music, even tried lightening the mood by singing for them his favorite song, Little Darlin'. Naturally, no one ever openly discussed what was happening outside the bunker. One day the siege was over and that was it. Dominic felt he passed his tests and had survived real peril. He began feeling wiser and somehow more special than his classmates at Public School 200. He was a keeper of secrets, so big he could never even admit to having them. The next 2 years were comparatively uneventful. If there was still a power struggle in the underworld, Dominic could not tell by the demeanor of Nino, nor uncles Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano, when he saw them at lunches and family occasions. It was a happy time of music, sports, and friends. He added At the Hop to his repertoire and formed a neighborhood group, the Tune-Ups. His fire-plug body was put to good use as a catcher in the Bath Beach Bensonhurst Little League, and he stole a first kiss from a girl at Coney Island. He began to develop keen pride in his Brooklyn heritage. He had come along at the peak of the borough's fame. People from Brooklyn were making it big in every walk of life. He had heard Nino say many times, "If they're not from Brooklyn, they're farmers," and he adopted the cocky saying as his own. Only cool kids came from Brooklyn. When Dominic turned 12, however, his mother announced stunning news. She intended to marry Anthony Montilio, a man she had been dating, and move out of Brooklyn. Dominic liked his future stepdad. Like Anthony Santamaria, Anthony Montilio was an Army Air Corps veteran. He had taken the boy sightseeing to West Point and given him a football. Still, the news was breathtaking. After the marriage, the couple was buying a house in Levittown, 30 miles east on Long Island, and she might even have a baby. As the shock wore off, Dominic began looking on the move as an adventure. Without hearing her say so, he knew his mother was happy to put some distance between herself and that life of Nino's, where people were killed or just disappeared. Though silently attracted to one aspect of Nino's life, the daring uniqueness of it, he decided some distance was probably good for him too. After his mother's marriage, she asked him to use the name Dominic Montilia when it was time to enroll in another school. Because he did like his stepdad and wanted to please his mother, and although he was not legally adopted, he agreed. The new family left for Levittown in the summer of 1960, unaware that Nino was about to revenge a personal loss, close the books on an underworld power struggle, and become a made member of what was now the Gambino Mafia family, all in one vicious stroke. In October, a lawyer for a gangster named Vincent Squilanti told newspaper reporters that his client was missing. Squilanti was president of the trade group representing the city's private commercial waste cartel and had been identified as a major drug dealer in testimony before the United States Senate Racket Subcommittee in Washington. In Bath Beach, however, he had also been identified as the man who shot Frank Scalisi and then lured a revenge-minded Joseph Scalisi to the same fate. Officially, the disappearance remained a mystery, but many times over the years, Anthony Gaggi gave this account to people he trusted. "We surprised him in the Bronx. who shot him in the head, stuffed him in the trunk, then dumped him for good. Nino and his accomplices took the body to the basement of a building on 10th Street in Alphabet City, Nino's old neighborhood. There, in the building's furnace, the former member of the 10th Street mob cremated the man who killed his childhood hero. In Levittown, one of the nation's first post-war-style suburbs, Dominic Montilio became an all-American teenager. He delivered newspapers, flipped hamburgers at a McDonald's, hung out at the mall, played varsity football, and lost his virginity in a grassy field behind school. The only blemish was a period during his freshman year when he rebelled against his stepfather's authority and began ditching school. After much pleading from his mother, he began to behave, but had missed so many classes that he'd spent the next 3 years making up credits. During that time, his mother gave birth to 2 children, Stephen and Michelle, who grew up not knowing their busy older brother had a different father. The activity Dominic enjoyed most was his music. His voice was now low and mellow, and at 14 he joined some other boys who had performed at dances and weddings. They called themselves the Four Directions. They liked the songs of black singers, and that became their hook, white boys who sounded black. One night, they tried out a new song in a shopping center alcove that simulated an echo chamber. 2 doors away, the owner of a liquor store chain was impressed. He offered to back them with money for stage clothes and expenses. In weeks, the boys were looking aces and singing in popular Long Island nightclubs, warming up crowds for concerts by the Shirelles and Little Anthony and the Imperials, premier black groups of the era. The Four Directions began getting stars in their eyes. Anthony Gaggi, however, tried to keep Dominic's feet on the ground. The music business is a rotten, dirty business, he would say during family reunions in Brooklyn. I don't care about the business, just the music, Dominic would reply to no avail. The Montilios and the Gaggis got together nearly every Sunday, particularly after Nino's father Angelo died of a heart attack in 1962. The Montilios always went to Brooklyn because Nino hated driving on the busy Long Island Expressway. Marie Montilio put up with it because otherwise she would never see her mother, now living alone in the apartment above Nino and Rose. Her husband Anthony put up with it too, for Marie's sake. Dominic thought his uncle's attitude about the music business was hypocritical. The musicians he was meeting were saying that mafia people were making moves on the music industry. He believed it because some Italian-American singers he regarded lightly seemed to be on the radio all the time. They were proof it was possible to manufacture a hit out of a bad song. All it took was enough cash to grease a disc jockey's palm. The Four Directions were certain of stardom when, after an audition, a record company agreed to record a song a friend had written, Tonight We Love. The words were original, but the music was a knockoff of a Tchaikovsky piano concerto. Sales were modest, but the record got the group into another studio, where they sang backup vocals on an album by Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels, a popular group. The album included a big hit, Sock It To Me, but the song Dominic liked most was A Face in the Crowd, for which he did the vocal arrangement. Friends said it was a fitting song because Dominic had impressed them as so unusual in one regard. Moving from singer to athlete to student to McDonald's grill man, he seemed to take on a different persona at each stop. It was not just the clothes or the uniform that changed. It was the body language, speech, and manners. His friends called him a chameleon. One night, the Four Directions got giddy on Thunderbird wine and decided to crash Carnegie Hall in Manhattan. The 45-minute drive sobered them up some, however, and they decided to just hang outside the Carnegie entrance. Doing so, they noticed an overhang that reminded them of the echo chamber created by the alcove at the shopping center where they sounded so good, and the liquor distributor discovered them. It was an omen. Tonight We Love, the boys began, straining their voices, banging Tchaikovsky's notes against the concrete and steel. As they continued, a few people stopped and applauded. But as a concert crowd poured out of the theater and swelled around, they suffered stage fright. They stopped singing and ran off. A few blocks away, a limousine pulled alongside them. A chauffeur got out and said his boss was in show business and wanted to meet them. The Four Directions returned to Carnegie Hall and met June Havoc, hostess of a television variety show. "I'd love you to be on my show," she told them. Just like that, the Four Directions made their television debut. It led to other shows, including an American Bandstand-type show in Cleveland, where the guests also included a young couple, Sonny and Cher. Dominic chatted with both, but the Indian-looking Cher, with her peculiar beauty and black hair to her buttocks, so unnerved him he never remembered anything she said. Promoting Tonight We Love, the Four Directions also played Arthur, a club in Manhattan owned by actor Richard Burton's former wife Sybil, and the Uptown Theater in Philadelphia, a famous black club whose audience clapped them to 2 encores. Still, the Four Directions act was limited. To make it big, they had to have a runaway hit record and to establish their own image. They could not make it big singing only other groups' songs. A friend in another group wrote them a song they thought would do the trick, but the label that had recorded them before was not interested. The limited success of Tonight We Love was not enough to overcome the perception that all they were was a warm-up act. Dominic believed the real reason was that 4 other Italian-American singers for the label, the very hot Four Seasons, did not want it promoting potential rivals. Believing the group just needed one more break, Dominic asked Nino for help. He thought that with one telephone call to Uncle Carlo, Nino could make it happen. He believed Carlo already controlled a record company in New Jersey. In the clubs, he had heard such stories, and in newspapers read more. He felt guilty invoking his blood connection to that life, but not too guilty. He did have talent. All we need is this one little push, someone to make the record, he told Nino. I don't think that business is for you. I told you it's not the business, it's the music. All they do in that business is drugs and women. It's not for you, forget about it. The patronizing attitude was infuriating. Dominic raised his voice against Nino for the first time. Who are you telling me what's good for me? You came here with your hat in your hand. So it would be cooler if I was a murderer and ran around the streets being a loan shark, is that it? Nino moved closer to Dominic. I think you should watch what you say. Loan shark is okay. Professional artist, forget about it. You better leave now or I'm going to pop you in the nose. Dominic left the bunker angry and humiliated. He detested everything his uncle was and himself for trying to use him. The Four Directions stayed together another year, but never went any farther than they had already gone. In their disappointment, they began to resent each other. They bickered over who had the best voice and the number of leads each sang. When Dominic was 17, they disbanded. That same year, 1965, Dominic graduated from MacArthur High School in Levittown. Frustrated by the dead end of his musical career, he wanted something new and dramatic, but had no idea what. Angry at Nino and sour on New York, he wanted to run off, but had no idea where. He had the ability for college, but not the desire or discipline. Bitterly, he declined Nino's offer to help him get a job. Adrift, he found work on his own, an assembly line job at the Grumman Aircraft Corporation. Meanwhile, a friend joined the Army Reserves and began telling Dominic about an elite unit, the Green Berets, the Army had recently formed. The Berets were superstar warriors. At the time, in Vietnam, they were helping put down a communist revolution. It sounded exciting to Dominic, daring and unique. He also had a heroic self-image and was genuinely, if naively, patriotic. Moreover, he was spontaneous. On Valentine's Day 1966, he left Grumman in a defiant mood after arguing with the foreman. On his way home, he saw a recruiting center. He stopped and went inside. He walked past the Coast Guard and the Marines before locating the Army. The Four Directions breakup had not completely shattered his confidence. I want to be a Green Beret, he said. The recruiter thought he was joking and started to laugh. Just because you want it doesn't mean you get it. It ain't that easy. Didn't ask if it was easy. Okay? I can't guarantee you Green Beret. All I can guarantee you is basic training. After that, if you want to be a Green Beret, you must volunteer and be accepted for advanced infantry, then Airborne Ranger School, then Special Forces School. That's Green Beret. But only if they want you. Great, where do I sign? That night, the new recruit told his stunned mother, if you're going to go to war, you might as well go all the way. His mother did not like the bravado. It reminded her he had some Anthony Gaggi qualities. But as the shock wore off, Anthony Gaggi was the reason she became supportive. She feared her restless son might eventually run toward Nino's world. The Army put him on a different path. Just remember to stay alive, she said. Puffed up, Dominic went to Brooklyn to tell Nino, and got a reaction only partially expected. People are getting killed over there, you idiot. And for what? To prop up a bunch of rice farmers? It's insane. I know it sounds corny to you, but I am going to fight for my country. Dominic paused. like my dad did and my stepdad. They were stupid too. Don't fight for generals, fight for us. If you want to die, die for your family. Dominic was startled by Nino's last words. For the first time, it sounded as though he was referring to the Gambino family, not the Gaggi or Montilio. He felt anger, surprise, fear, and pride all at the same time, and was momentarily speechless. I ain't going to die, he finally said, then marched away. Chapter 2. Bully Boy. Not long after Dominic left for the army, Nino became acquainted with a young man with neither the looks nor the talent for the music business. Roy Albert DeMeo had a lot of other qualities that impressed Nino, however: intelligence, energy, resourcefulness, and by age 25, a lot of experience with the things that interested Nino: cars, loans, and money. Roy did not wear this completely on his sleeve, not yet anyway. But deep down he also had a mean and bitter streak, a bully's heart capable of beating even more ruthlessly than Nino's. They met when Roy came to Bath Beach one day to visit his mother, a widow who had recently moved into the home of a widowed friend who lived a few blocks from the bunker. Nino already knew of Roy, because Roy was already a minor criminal legend in certain parts of adjoining working-class neighborhoods east of Bath Beach, Flatlands, and Canarsie. Nino heard about him from friends in the much smaller Lucchese mafia family, which controlled tow truck companies, junkyards, and car theft operations in that part of Brooklyn, and which was historically close to the Gambino family because children of the two bosses had gotten married. Always on the alert for new business partners, as was Roy, Nino sent a message to mutual acquaintances for Roy to stop by the next time he was in Bath Beach. Roy did not need a second invitation. Anthony Gaggi was a made man in the Gambino family, the city's most important, and Roy was nothing if not ambitious and opportunistic. He did not intend to spend his life hanging out at junkyards, the horizon he saw with the Lucchese family. Roy also was a man who liked to keep up with the Joneses, and he made enough illegal money to afford it. In 1966, he left Brooklyn and settled in the suburban haven of Massapequa Park on Long Island, moving into a substantial home he custom-built on 3 adjacent lots on Park Place. He did a lot of the work himself, because among all his other still-developing qualities, Roy was adroit with tools. He lived there with his wife, Gladys, who was already regretting having married Roy 6 years before, but was also accommodating to it, and their children, who were about to number 3. It was quite a feat for Roy to raise the necessary couple of $100,000 to buy into exclusive Massapequa Park. Even if the house was not in the absolute best part of town, Massapequa Park was still where Carlo Gambino himself owned a country manor, to go along with his Brooklyn apartment. Roy drove by the old legend's house many times through the years, but as ambitious as he was, he never dared to drop in without an invitation, which never came because Roy was not even on the bottom of the totem pole yet. With his egg-shaped face, slicked back hair, and lumpy build, Roy looked more like an indifferent civil servant than a prosperous young gangster. But as many people already knew, it was hard to be indifferent about Roy. They either liked him or kept their distance, usually out of fear. Though overweight, Roy was incredibly strong and a wicked sucker puncher in a bar fight. He was also a criminal anomaly in that he was raised in an ordinary middle-class family, an extraordinary one once you went beyond his parents. His mother never worked, but his father, who died when Roy was 19, was a sternly law-abiding laundry company delivery man, whom Roy stopped getting along with once he hit his teenage years and set much higher financial goals for himself. Other relatives of Roy, however, were distinguished professional men. One uncle, a former top prosecutor for the Brooklyn District Attorney, was a professor at Brooklyn Law School. Another uncle ran a Buick dealership. His father's cousin was the medical examiner for New York City, a big job. Roy's mother, who he did get along with, always wanted him to be a doctor too, he always said. "You know something?" Roy would say later in life. "I am just my family's black sheep." "You know something" was a phrase he put at the front of many sentences, as if he wanted people to concentrate on the unique statement he was about to make. From Massapequa Park, Roy still drove his new Cadillac into Brooklyn each day, back to his base of operations and his roots. His office was a blue-collar bar, Phil's Lounge, that was just a few blocks from his childhood home in Flatlands. He rarely had a drink at the bar, though Roy did like a drink at home after the day's scheming was done. He also was a familiar sight at neighborhood hangouts like Benny's Candy Store, Jimmy's Restaurant, and a bowling alley for nostalgic Brooklyn Dodgers fans, Gil Hodges Lanes. Roy may have gone to live next door to the Joneses, but since high school and for the rest of his life, he worked among the Profachis, the Denomis, the Ferrangis, the Doughertys, all friends and acquaintances from his below 20 years. Flatlands was a historic neighborhood. Roy's childhood home was 5 blocks from where the first Dutch settlers in Brooklyn built their village square. Saluting a town in Holland, the explorers christened the settlement New Amersfoort, but that name eventually gave way to one descriptive of what attracted them, flat land. The treeless plains of that far western section of mid-17th century Long Island suited the Dutch, who were inexperienced at clearing forests. The land was occupied by Delaware Valley Indians known as the Canarsie, meaning fort in their language.
The main encampment of the Canarsie was across a narrow inlet of the Atlantic Ocean to the east, and so the area across the inlet from Flatlands became known, with a variant spelling, as Canarsie. At the start of the 20th century, non-farm families began moving into Flatlands. The first subdivisions were built in the 1920s. By 1941, when Roy's family arrived, most of the community was paved over. From Bath Beach, Flatlands was 7 miles northeast along the Brooklyn coastline and connected by roads built on original Canarsie trails. Roy's family moved into a very bunker-like red brick house on Avenue P when he was just a month old, and the 4th baby of Anthony and Eleanor DeMeo. Their other children were a girl 2 years older than Roy and 2 boys, one 10 years older, the other 7. As in Nino Gaggi's case, as was common then, a few of Roy's relatives, an uncle, aunt, and 2 cousins, also lived in the house on the top floor. Everyone had been residing in Williamsburg, an older Brooklyn neighborhood directly across the East River from Manhattan that had been settled by their Neapolitan ancestors. Because of Roy's father's steady delivery job, the family was no better or worse off than most of their similarly employed and hard-working neighbors, mostly second-generation immigrants of Italian and Irish background. Still, like everyone else, the family watched its pennies, especially after Eleanor gave birth to her 5th and final child, another boy, in 1950. As Roy would, all the DeMeo kids took after-school jobs as soon as they were old enough. As Roy approached his 10th year, his second oldest brother, who was named after his father Anthony, took a job as a soda jerk at a popular local fountain. Anthony was nicknamed Chubby. He was short but very broad and muscular in the upper body from working out with weights. Everyone on the block loved Chubby and thought he was the most promising DeMeo kid. Roy's mother actually dreamed of Chubby becoming a doctor before Roy. Roy's father was putting away all his overtime so his namesake could attend college, a first in their branch of the family. They could only help one, and it was going to be Chubby. 16-year-old Chubby slipped Roy a free chocolate shake now and then, but not too often, because Roy was already grossly overweight. Other kids taunted him about it. "Hey, little fat boy, why don't you roll on over here?" Some of the older brats in the Ferrangi house, one door away, or the Duddy house across the street, would yell out at Roy as he left for parish school a few blocks away. Because of his weight, Roy was so slow of foot that sooner or later, most of the neighborhood's jerks got around to terrorizing him. A favorite game, especially if some girl was within sight, involved 3 or more morons sneaking up on Roy from behind. While 2 held his arms, a 3rd pulled his britches down. None of this ever happened, however, when Chubby DeMeo was on the block. And even if he was off mixing shakes, some jerks were made to pay the price later. The more bulky Chubby got from lifting weights, the less Roy was bothered. Naturally, Roy began to idolize his powerful, popular brother. Roy's Roman Catholic parish school, St. Thomas Aquinas, was only 4 blocks from home. All the DeMeo kids went there until they were old enough for public high school. Roy was an inquisitive student, if a bit too talkative in class, and he got good marks. The school also tried to hammer home the values of religious devotion and patriotism, for God and country was carved into the school's cornerstone. Like Chubby, Roy was more patriotic than devout. In 1951, after war broke out in Korea, 17-year-old Chubby caused his parents worry
by volunteering for the Marine Corps. Still, they were proud, and he was a dashing sight in his dress blues. Roy told friends of his plans to enlist too, but this changed when only a few months after Chubby set sail for Korea, 2 Marines in dress blues knocked on the door of the house on Avenue P and said Chubby DeMeo had been killed in action. The neighbors always talked about how there was never another happy day in the DeMeo home after that. Roy's mother stopped talking and sat weeping in her bedroom for 3 months. No one ever saw a smile on Roy's father's face again either. Roy was devastated too, but began to express his hurt in ways that surprised neighbors. At St. Thomas Aquinas, Roy began picking on the younger, smaller kids for no reason but the anger inside. He continued to get good grades, but he became a fat little bully boy. At home, neighbors began to hear violent shouting between Roy and his father Anthony. Roy's new ways were not the only problem. His father had instructed Roy to avoid all contact with 3 boys about his age who lived 2 doors away, the Profaci brothers. Their uncle was Joseph Profaci, a well-known mafia boss. On Friday nights, a lot of well-known gangsters came in Cadillacs to the Profaci home on Avenue P to play poker. Anthony DeMeo knew well of the Profaci crowd because one of his brothers, Albert, was a top prosecutor for the Brooklyn District Attorney and had tried to send many of them to jail. Roy owed his middle name to Uncle Albert. Roy, however, liked the Profaci boys and liked to sit on the stoop with them as all the gangsters arrived in their big shiny cars. They looked as dashing to Roy as Marines in dress blues once did. "That was my brother Chubby's mistake," Roy would say later on, "believing all that Marine bullshit." Roy's father slapped him a few times for violating his order not to hang out with the Profaci brothers, but the slaps were no match for the thrill Roy got watching the gangsters come and go. Besides, Roy's mother did not feel the same about the situation as her husband. She was good friends with the mother of the Profaci boys. The boys were not gangsters, she tried pointing out to him. In fact, all were smart students headed for college. In 1955, Roy graduated 8th grade and enrolled in James Madison High School, one of the city's best. Its graduates, determined to fulfill the dreams of their immigrant grandparents and parents, included 2 Nobel Prize winners, environmentalist Barry Commoner, writer Irwin Shaw, writer-producer Garson Kanin, and many other notables in their fields, including popular New York DJ Bruce Morrow and several more writers and reporters, lawyers, politicians, and actors. The singer Carole King was one class ahead of Roy. Roy was slimmer now, but hardly svelte. His anger was more under control, but when unleashed in a street fight, it was something few classmates wanted to see. Roy scratched, gouged, kicked, did anything possible to get the advantage. All of that occurred outside school, however. In school, Roy earned good conduct, punctuality, and perfect attendance awards many times. Except for his father, he seemed to respect people with power. On his report cards, his teachers wrote that Roy was dependable, well-behaved, and cooperative. Some teachers even thought Roy was a bit of a brown-noser. Throughout high school, he was a room assistant and lunchroom guard. Stool pigeon jobs similar to the one that, in 1957 in Bath Beach, had gotten newly elected class president Dominic Santamaria Montilio in such trouble with his Uncle Nino. Disappointing his mother, who wanted him to try and become the doctor Chubby was supposed to be, Roy elected to concentrate on manual arts in high school. His impatience to get out of his father's house and begin making money was too strong for him to think about committing himself to 8 or more years of study. It certainly was not because he could not cut it academically. Competing against some of the city's ablest college-bound students in mandatory academic classes, he scored well above average. With students in shop classes, Roy talked about the Profaci crowd. With students in biology class, he talked about his Uncle Albert, a prominent prosecutor and a man who had power. Uncle Albert's name was frequently in the newspapers, most notably for putting away some brainy boys from Williamsburg who murdered a vagrant, apparently on a lark. In what was known as the Thrill Kill case, Albert DeMeo defeated the big-time Manhattan defense lawyers hired by the boys' wealthy parents. One irony of Albert's work, of course, was that he prosecuted friends and relatives of Roy's friends, the Profaci boys, including Joseph Profaci, their uncle. Albert, however, lost more of these cases than he won. A characteristic of mafia cases, he complained often enough for Roy to hear, was that witnesses get up on the stand and don't say what they said to the grand jury. Roy never forgot that indirect lesson or its implication. The witnesses had been intimidated, and the technique worked. At James Madison, Roy was an honor student in manual arts. The curriculum plan permitted him to leave school early in the afternoon to work. So at age 15, he found a part-time job stocking shelves and delivering groceries on a 3-wheeled bicycle for Banner Dairy, a local grocery store. The store manager, Charles Healy, a young Marine just home from Korea, did not understand why Roy sneered about this until he learned about Chubby from other teenagers. Roy also impressed Healy as one of the hardest workers he ever met. When Roy made deliveries, he loaded the bike with twice as many orders as anyone else. Soon he was making up to $100 a week, great money for a teenager in 1956. Working in the store, Roy slimmed down further. Like Chubby when he was that age, he also put on muscle. In the basement of Banner Dairy, he began weightlifting 100-pound cartons of Ivory Snow detergent boxes, the heaviest in the store. He called it working out with Ivory Large, and it became a ritual. The store manager and others gathered to watch him work out. "Okay, Roy," Healy would say, "that's 11. One more, you break your record." Roy broke his record many times, but eventually lost interest in weightlifting. Gradually, he put on weight again, but retained his Ivory Large upper body strength. Healy, who became a cop and then a United States Marshal in Brooklyn after his days at Banner Dairy, once teased Roy about a much larger kid he also employed there. "You better not fool around with Dave, he'll knock you on your ass." One day, Roy and Dave started teasing each other. It got out of hand, and Roy attacked his opponent so ferociously, scratching, gouging, kicking, that Healy became frightened. He and some of his other stock boys managed to pull Roy away, but not before Dave was a pulpy mess. "Roy is scary," Healy said after he sent Roy home and Dave was carted away. While still in high school and with delivery money to burn, Roy started loaning money to friends and eventually to anyone who asked. His reputation as a dirty fighter, newly reinforced by accounts of his attack on Dave, assured prompt payment of principal and vig. Loan sharking was just the sort of contaminant Roy's father had in mind when he ordered Roy to avoid the Profaci boys. And one day not long after it began, neighbors saw Roy and his father slugging it out in the middle of Avenue P. By his senior year, Roy was carrying cash around in brown paper bags and driving a not-too-used Cadillac. He was the star of the manual arts crowd at James Madison and would pick up the tab for beer bashes, which he enjoyed. He loved showing off his money. It made him feel powerful. More and more teens short of cash on date night borrowed money, and by the time he graduated in 1959, Roy was, for someone 18, fairly prosperous. He told the yearbook editors that his career goal was business. Because he was overweight and not the most handsome guy in Flatlands, Roy was not successful with neighborhood girls. Soon after graduating, he married one of the first who ever said yes to a date. Her name was Gladys Britton. She was petite, quiet, 2 years older, and cute. She also was a good person and out of a respectable family, so Roy's parents were happy for him and her. As his oldest brother and older sister had, Roy left the house on Avenue P, leaving only a younger brother at home. Between his job and the loan sharking, Roy was able to rent a nice apartment not far away. At Banner Dairy, he became assistant manager, an occasional apprentice to the man who ran the butcher shop. The man taught Roy how to slice apart whole steers quickly and efficiently. Roy was just marking time at Banner Dairy, however. By now, he fully intended to make his living as a loan shark. There were just too many suckers out there, and he kept putting more money on the street, as he described it. On the night of December 12, 1960, Anthony DeMeo, Roy's 55-year-old father, was found dead in a subway car, felled by a heart attack as he went to work. Roy did not wish his old man ill, but he got over the death more quickly than he did Chubby's. And when his mother took her youngest son and went to Italy for a few years to grieve and live with relatives near Naples, Roy suddenly had no immediate family members around. Roy and Gladys, however, had already started building their own family, and in 5 weeks' time, Gladys gave birth to a baby girl, the first of 3 children she had during the next 8 years. Roy was wild about his kids, less so over time his wife. They got married before they really knew one another well, a particular problem for her because, while she knew about Roy's loan business, she never meant to marry a full-fledged criminal, which is what Roy became during this time. She shut her eyes to it, however, and stayed married for the kids' sake and her own. Roy did provide, copiously. Roy began launching his career in crime from Phil's Lounge, the neighborhood bar a few blocks from his old home in Flatlands. With an eclectic assortment of friends, acquaintances, loan shark customers, and even some of the jerks who taunted him when he was just a slow little fat boy, Roy had been hanging out at the bar since graduating from high school. At one time or another, the crowd included the 3 Profaci brothers, the 5 Ferrangi brothers, the 3 Dougherty brothers, and the 3 Denomi brothers. All except the Denomis were from Avenue P. Some in the crowd, such as the Profaci boys, were actually college students and not around as often. Others, such as one of the Dougherty boys, had joined the police force, but John Dougherty still came around. His brother Charles tended bar once in a while. The group also included a future burglar, an electrical contractor, a tailor, a sportswear retailer, and in the case of one of the older Ferrangi brothers, Richard, a Hollywood actor in such films as Prince of the City and Serpico, but only after he got out of prison for an armed robbery conviction. Roy's best friend at the time was Frank Ferrangi, the future electrical contractor. Frank was interested in guns and had begun to collect them. He taught Roy about various weapons, and Roy would eventually become a collector too, in a more elaborate way and for different purposes, of course. Once he became interested in guns, Roy practiced firing them and became good and fast, especially after John Dougherty, who was police trained, showed him the finer points of the combat firing position. One of Roy's friendships showed that he was capable of sympathy for people who had been tormented as he was when he was young. He had gone out of his way to befriend one of the Denomi brothers, Frederick, who came from the wrong side of the tracks in Canarsie, an area known as Pigtown, because even in the early 1960s, swine farms were still prevalent there. Freddie was a mechanic at a Canarsie gasoline station, where Roy and others from Phil's Lounge bought their gas cheap. Freddie never made it past 4th grade, because school doctors failed to diagnose a dyslexic condition that made it difficult for him to understand letters and numbers. Instead, they classified him as a slow learner and threw him in with students who were actually retarded. Some people, but not Roy, made fun of the lean and gawky mechanic because he never did learn to read or write, and because he sometimes acted like his synapses were not firing, the way some mentally disabled kids do. He was, however, a genius with cars. Unable to make sense of manuals, he still made engines purr and built new ones out of others' junk. Freddie was 12 days younger than Roy. His mother had died about the same time as chubby DeMeo. Roy invited him and his brother Richard, who was not much of a genius about anything, to stop by Phil's Lounge anytime. Roy's benevolence made Freddie a fiercely loyal friend. "Roy is the smartest guy I know," he would tell everyone. "I would do anything for Roy." The friendship had its rewards. Freddie had already done 2 years in jail for stealing a truckload of batteries. And he was not just a mechanic when Roy met him. He was a car thief, working for the Lucchese mafia men who ran the Canarsie junkyards. Freddie specialized in Volkswagens. Parts were scarce, therefore valuable. Freddie also stole motorcycles whenever he or any of a group of motorcycle hounds he rode with needed a spare part. The motorcyclists were known as the aliens of Pigtown. Through Freddie, Roy began meeting a vast new array of possible loan shark customers. Thieves, robbers, hijackers, all manner of lowlifes. Through Freddie, Roy even met some of the Lucchese mafia gangsters who ran the junkyards. He was not that impressed. Eventually, all these people made their way to Phil's Lounge, joining the cops, firemen, and other city workers from the neighborhood, who came to socialize and make a bet with the bar's bookmakers. For Roy, working this crowd was like shooting ducks in a pond. Soon he had so much money on the street and so much coming back on a regular basis that he quit Banner Dairy. From age 22 on, he never worked another legitimate day. He began stealing cars with Freddie, not because he needed the money, but to learn the business. Same thing with the break-ins he committed with a friend from the Avenue P crowd. Working the bar crowd, he also fenced stolen cars and other property. In time, he became a kind of concierge of crime in Flatlands and Canarsie, the person to see for this or that. Making his deals, Roy emphasized the making of relationships just as much. Relationships produce benefits beyond the immediate deal, he always said. "My business is just buying and selling," Roy began to say to Gladys and everyone else, including his mother, after she returned from Italy, and moved into the home of her good friend, Mrs. Profaci. who was a widow now too and living in Bath Beach. In 1965, Roy began demonstrating what was to be a lifelong paranoia about the Internal Revenue Service, the only arm of the law that really scared him. He could not just fail to file, as many criminals do, because he had already demonstrated a filing history while working at Banner Dairy. So Roy, through his relationships, worked out deals with a couple of friends who owned small businesses to carry him on their books as an employee. The trick was deciding how much salary to claim. The more salary, the more taxes, and naturally he wanted to pay the smallest possible tax. This became a trickier equation as Roy made plans to build a house in Massapequa Park. How to avoid IRS suspicion that his lifestyle exceeded his income while still chiseling every dime he could. At Gil Hodges Lanes one day, before the move to Massapequa Park, Roy sought out a former St. Thomas Aquinas classmate who was now an IRS agent. He asked how the IRS conducted net worth cases, how it proved someone spent more than they reported as income. How would you make such a case against a guy who said he made his money gambling? The agent put Roy off, one of the rare times Roy was unable to develop a relationship, and it angered him. When he later ran into the agent at a wake for a mutual acquaintance, he loudly and sarcastically proclaimed to a group of mourners that stool pigeons were in the room and he was leaving. After building his house in Massapequa Park, and despite his worries about his fictional returns, Roy was the most successful 25-year-old that he knew, with the possible exception of Freddie DeNomi. With money made from stolen Volkswagens, Freddie had built a race car and become a star on the professional drag racing circuit. Late-night television commercials promoted the appearances of Broadway Freddie at local and national racetracks. He was making $100,000 a year. In 1966, after his first get-acquainted meeting with Anthony Gaggi, Roy set his sights on becoming a member of the Gambino mafia family. From his Uncle Albert's old stories and his contacts in the Lucchese family, he already knew a lot about its history. After winning the power struggle that followed the assassination of Albert Anastasia, Carlo Gambino had inherited an army of some 250 made men and at least that many collaborators. They controlled a network of gambling, fencing, and prostitution operations and held key positions with labor unions and trade groups in the garment, construction, food, and private sanitation industries. Men dealing drugs were ordered to stop or be killed. Carlo believed that the severe penalties attached to drug crimes pressured defendants to become informers. Since Carlo's takeover, the family's influence had spread like a virus. Carlo orchestrated schemes affecting everyday life in many ways, from monopolistic practices that added a few dollars to the cost of clothes and food, to the bid rigging, bribes, and threats that added many thousands to the costs of unloading ships and building skyscrapers. The racketeering produced cash for loan sharking. The family became an underground city bank for people unable to get legitimate loans. Carlo's men borrowed from him at low interest, then loaned the money out at high interest. Their books yielded regular income and business opportunities that fed the virus. Nino Gaggi was a good example. By 1966, he received hundreds of dollars a week in interest from loans to jewelry shops, truck companies, and many clients in the car world, repair shops, used car lots, gas stations, and automobile dealerships. The customers knew that if they failed to meet their obligations, they had to invite their unforgiving banker into their businesses, and thus Nino had become a secret owner of a restaurant in Manhattan, a film processing lab in Brooklyn, and another Manhattan operation that made and distributed counterfeit copies of X-rated films. Although doing well, Nino wanted more. That's what the game was about, and that's why he wanted to meet the dynamo from Flatlands, who was making so much he had already built a fancy home, whereas Nino was just beginning to scout out property in Florida, on which he intended to build a deluxe getaway for himself, Rose, and their children. It increased Nino's status in the family if he also earned more for Carlo and Paul. By mafia tradition, a soldier was obligated to give his capo a negotiable percentage of his earnings, just as the capo was expected to do the same with his boss.
Predictably, nearly everyone cheated, but the more money one earned, the less it hurt to give some up.
To test a possible relationship, Nino proposed that he and Roy co-make a loan to one of Nino's customers, a used car dealer who wanted to expand. Roy jumped at the chance and promised to pick up the man's payments and faithfully bring Nino's share to him. That way, dependable Roy would get to see Nino more. That same year, 1966, Roy began building another relationship that eventually led him to the business Carlo Gambino had banned, drug dealing. Like the one he had with the pitiable mechanic who became a successful drag racer, Freddie Denomi, this relationship was a person he felt sympathy for, a 16-year-old kid with a huge chip on his shoulder because he was short and Jewish when he wanted to be tall and Italian like all his friends. Just as with Freddie, Roy met Chris Rosenberg at a gas station in Canarsie, and he could see that underneath the chip the kid was ambitious and smart. For one thing, he knew who Roy was. Chris was making a few bucks dealing marijuana, and Roy loaned him some money so he could deal in larger amounts. Throughout the late 1960s, Roy continued to nurture his relationship with Nino. They made more loans together, and Roy found new markets for Nino's counterfeit X-rated film operation. Roy and Nino each had what the other wanted. Roy was a moneymaker. Nino had influence. Working for Nino, Roy would have Gambino family cachet, which would enhance his money-making, especially if he too ever became a made man. So by 1970, Roy was working for Nino and giving him hundreds a week just for being his boss. During that time, Roy also brought Chris Rosenberg along, loaning him money for more drug deals and selling off the cars that Chris and his friends stole to his connections in the Canarsie junkyards. Chris introduced his friends to Roy, and by 1972, Roy was the Fagin of Flatlands, with his own loyal crew of young drug dealers and car thieves. It was not all business, however. Roy and his young friends got together socially. They went to watch Broadway Freddie race and to Frank Ferrangi's farm, where they learned to shoot the guns Roy had begun collecting. His collection, which was more like an arsenal, included machine guns, automatic rifles, shotguns, and silencers for the handguns. Roy also invited them to Massapequa Park for barbecues, generally the only time Roy let people see him get drunk. None had ever seen a house like Roy's, at least not from the inside, where all the floors were marble. Roy now even employed a gardener and a maid, and the food and drink he offered were always top shelf. Like diminutive Chris, the young men closest to Roy were all good-looking characters, if in a dangerous sort of way. The contrast between them and Roy was actually remarkable. Where he was dowdy and lumpy, they were chiseled and sleek. Some years later, someone videotaped one of the elaborate barbecues, which were by then a DeMeo crew tradition. No one ever said Roy ever made amorous moves on his crew, but in the videotape, as he ate, drank, and swapped stories with his crew, he looked like a man who might pay handsome young men to hang around, not for actual sex necessarily, but for the hint and scent of it. Roy had begun cheating on Gladys with some of the barmaids who worked at his office in Flatlands. It began happening after Phil's lounge came up short of cash, and Roy stepped in with $6,000 and became the secret owner as the bar was reborn, the Gemini Lounge. On paper, the bar was owned by one of the Dougherty brothers from Avenue P, Charles, the one Roy was closest to. It was incorporated as Charlie D's, but before it opened, Dougherty, a horoscope fan, decided his astrological sign provided a better name. Another Dougherty brother, Daniel, helped out with the bartending, and so did another one of the Ferrangi brothers, also named Charles. Roy's new friends knew he was unfaithful because he bragged about it. Success with women was something Roy never experienced as a teenager, but now that he had money and status, at least in the Gemini Lounge context, Roy discovered that some plain Janes would jump into bed with him. Because his marriage was more one of convenience anyway, he never lost a guilty moment over these one-hour stands in an apartment next to the Gemini. Even if his marriage was a good one, he probably would not have felt guilt, given the gross remarks he would make about his tawdry conquests. "I made her do things you wouldn't believe, and then I fucked her in the ass," Roy would tell his young friends. With Roy, sex was money. It was a way to show how strong he was.
Roy's neighbors did not fail to notice that a lot of young men were always pulling into Roy's driveway in fancy sports cars, but they were too discreet to comment on it in front of Roy and accommodating Gladys, who were actually a popular couple on Park Place.
If Roy noticed his neighbors raking leaves, he offered extra trash bags. When he cleaned his garage, he invited them to take what they wanted before tossing anything away. The front porch of the DeMeo's two-story, bay-windowed house offered a lovely view of a sloping, tree-lined yard, around which strong-armed Roy personally erected a corral-type fence. During holidays, the house was decorated inside and out, and an outdoor speaker system played seasonal music. Gladys, who loved being a mother, if not Roy's wife, marked every holiday with special batches of cookies for all the Park Place kids. The neighbors were also too polite to comment on the house's sophisticated alarm system, or the iron bars across the windows, or the irony of Roy saying he was going to his office when everyone else was coming home from theirs. His neighbors only saw the jovial, helpful side of dependable, cooperative, and well-behaved Roy. When the Haynes boy was struck by a car in the middle of the block, Roy was the first adult on the scene. He comforted the injured boy and took him to a hospital in nearby Amityville. Gladys told neighbors that Roy was still shaking when he came home because the Haynes boy was a playmate of their son Albert, who had inherited Roy's middle name, Roy's prominent lawyer uncle's first name. Roy kept saying he did what he did because that could have been Albert out there bleeding on the street, Gladys said. When some older boys began parking their cars around the corner from Park Place at all hours of the night and using the woods in a state park behind Roy's house for pot parties, Roy swung into action. With his German Shepherd watchdog Champ at his side one night, he went into the woods and confronted the teenagers. "I don't want any drugs in my neighborhood. Get the hell out and don't come back. Never." The neighbors figured the rumors about Roy, that he was a big racketeer in Brooklyn, must have reached the teenagers because they never did come back. Occasionally, Roy and Gladys hosted parties for everyone on the block. The biggest party every year was on the 4th of July and always featured an illegal fireworks display, which always drew a wink from the local cops. The next day, Roy would be out in the street, sweeping up Roman candle fragments. One year, a neighbor complained that some large rockets landed on his roof, and Roy promised to eliminate them the following year, which he did. Roy had to swindle a lot of money to support his life, but that was no problem. In partnership with Nino or his crew, or sometimes on his own, he was constantly panning the landscape for opportunity. For instance, in 1972, he joined the Borough of Brooklyn Credit Union, and within months had talked his way onto the board of directors. He soon showed some of his colleagues how they could earn something on the side by using the credit union as a laundering service for drug dealers Roy had met. With the others' connivance, Roy also dipped into credit union reserves to finance loans in his mushrooming book. Roy's book was still anchored in the car business, but it was soon to include a dentist, an abortion clinic, a flea market, and 2 restaurants. Unknown to Roy, someone in the credit union complained about what was going on there, and for the first time, Roy's name entered an official police file. That same year, an informant caused an FBI agent to place a sparse note in bureau files. 2 men known only as Nino and Roy had muscled their way into a company that processed X-rated films. It was the first time the name Nino appeared in any official file, too. Viewed from another angle, the note was even more significant. This newest scheme of Nino's and Roy's would lead Roy over the bridge, separating those who merely steal from those who kill. Nino had already crossed it. Once Roy did, removing the last barrier to unrestrained criminality, the bully in him would surface again in new, monstrous ways. Paul Rothenberg's X-rated business was a natural extension of the counterfeit film business Nino already had, for which Roy had been finding new markets. It was also a perfect extortion target. It was lucrative, yet small, uncomplicated, and only semi-legitimate. With a partner, Rothenberg owned 2 film processing labs. The labs served commercial clients, but also producers of X-rated and, in some cases, clearly pornographic movies, by the standards of New York's obscenity laws. Rothenberg, age 43, had been arrested 4 times, pleading guilty in one case to possessing what a judge described as the worst type of hardcore pornography. He was believed to be the largest processor of blue movies in New York, and charged as much as $30 per film. He lived with his wife and 3 children in a swank community on Long Island. One of Roy's loan shark customers told him about Rothenberg's business. On a spring day in 1972, Nino and Roy visited Rothenberg at his company's Manhattan headquarters. In the meeting, Nino would be the good cop, Roy the bad. Nino suggested to Rothenberg that with his and Roy's connections, they could help improve his business, if only he would make them silent partners. Rothenberg said no thanks and laughed. Roy then slapped him across the face, like Rothenberg was just a kid at St. Thomas Aquinas who had been disrespectful. In his hand, Roy also had a pistol from his collection. Rothenberg could hardly complain to the police, So he and his partner began paying Nino and Roy several $100s a week, the amount depending on the number of films they processed each week. Rothenberg hated being squeezed. A woman friend later told police she heard him arguing on the telephone once with someone he described as a partner who was taking too much money from him. "I just finished paying this guy off and he wants more," Rothenberg said to her. The arrangement lasted a year, until the labs were raided and Rothenberg and his partner, Anthony Arguilla, were arrested. The police took films they valued at $250,000, films with titles like Deep Throat No. 5. "We don't think we're doing anything wrong," Arguilla told police. "We're just making a living." Wrong or not, both faced several felony charges and heavy prison time. Nino and Roy instantly realized that they too were in serious trouble if either Rothenberg or Arguilla decided to reveal how they were extorted. The day after the raid, Roy met Rothenberg at a diner and gave him $25,000 toward his legal defense. It hardly seemed appropriate under the circumstances, but Roy also gave him a gold lady's wristwatch festooned with diamonds and asked him to try and fence it. The watch had been stolen in a $1 million hijacking at Kennedy Airport a few months before. In a few days, after sifting records confiscated in the raid, the police came back to Rothenberg and Arguilla and asked about checks made out to Roy DeMeo and cashed at the Borough of Brooklyn Credit Union. "Business expenses," Arguilla said. "Extortion payments," Rothenberg said. Rothenberg then refused to say any more. Over the next few days, a Manhattan assistant district attorney called Rothenberg's lawyer to urge him to urge his client to cooperate. Rothenberg might help his own case if he gave information about a mafia extortion scheme. Several meetings to discuss the proposal were scheduled, then canceled, the last on Friday, July 27, 1973. That night, Roy called Rothenberg and scheduled a meeting on Sunday morning at a diner near both their houses. Roy told him he wanted his hot lady's watch back, but in reality, Nino had decided Rothenberg had to be killed and had ordered Roy to do the job. Roy had already demonstrated he was an earner. It was time to see if he possessed the other necessary made-man trait, the murdering one. Roy was more than ready to oblige. The murder would seal his alliance with Nino and put him on the Gambino fast track. So in Roy's mind, murder, like sex and money, became just a way to show power. At the diner, Roy sat in his car and waited until Rothenberg arrived in his. Getting straight to the task, he ordered Rothenberg out of his car at silencer-equipped gunpoint, marched him into an alleyway, and fired 2 bullets into his head with the calm of an executioner. No muss, no fuss, no mistakes, no guilt. Rothenberg's partner, Anthony Arguilla, was boating when the murder occurred. In interviews with detectives, he made statements that were proven to be lies. He denied even knowing Roy, but detectives tailing Roy after the murder saw them meet twice. Arguilla knew his partner was thinking of cooperating, but Arguilla had decided it was safer to keep quiet, which he continued to do. When police questioned Roy, he told them only his name and address. With Arguilla afraid for his life, Roy was confident the case would go no further, and it never did. Roy's partner, the man known only as Nino, was not even identified. For 32-year-old Roy, the murder was an epiphanous moment. He tried explaining it to his young followers. You know something? After you kill someone, anything is possible.